There is a village in what is now Southern Cameroon where mothers still hum a melody to their sick children at night. They do not know the words. They do not know where the melody came from. They know only that it works, that children who hear it sleep deeper, heal faster, and wake calmer than those who do not. Scientists have studied this melody. They have measured the brain activity of children who hear it and compared it to those who hear other lullabies. The results are consistent and unexplainable. The melody activates parts of the brain associated with repair, with cellular regeneration, with the restoration of damaged neural pathways. No other piece of music in the world produces this effect. The scientists do not know why. The mothers do. They call the melody Egwu Adigboroja, the song that mends. And if you ask the oldest women in the village where it came from, they will lower their voices and tell you about a blind girl who could see through sound, who healed the mad and the broken with nothing but her voice, and who paid a price for her gift that no one should ever have to pay. Her name was Adannaya, and the melody the mothers hum is the last fragment of a song she sang over 2,000 years ago. This is the story of how that song was born. Adannaya entered the world silent. Most babies announce their arrival with a scream, that first furious declaration that they exist and the world must make room for them. Adannaya did not scream. She did not cry. She did not make any sound at all. The midwife held her up and slapped her back. Once, twice, 3 times, growing more desperate with each strike. Nothing. The baby breathed. Her chest rose and fell. Her heart beat beneath her tiny ribs. But her mouth remained closed, her throat silent. Her eyes shut against a world she did not seem interested in greeting. Then the midwife noticed the eyes. When she gently pulled back one of the baby's eyelids, she found only whiteness beneath, no color, no pupil, no iris. Just smooth, milky blankness where sight should have been. The midwife carried the baby to her mother, a young woman named Obiageli, and placed her carefully in the crook of her arm. Obiageli looked down at her daughter, at the closed mouth and the sealed white eyes, and she felt a coldness settle into her chest that would not leave for many years. In the Kingdom of Nkwo, where strength and ability determined a person's worth, a child who could not see and would not speak was considered a punishment from the spirits. Such children were often left in the forest within their first week of life, abandoned to whatever fate the wilderness provided. Obiageli's husband, a respected warrior named Ikena, stood at the entrance of the birthing hut and listened as the midwife delivered her assessment. The child was blind. The child appeared to be mute. The child would be a burden for the rest of her life, unable to work, unable to marry, unable to contribute anything to a family that already struggled to feed itself. Ikena said nothing for a long time. Then he walked into the hut, took the baby from his wife's arms, and held her against his chest. He felt her tiny heartbeat against his own, steady and strong, and he made a decision that went against every custom his people held. He would keep her. The village talked. They whispered that Ikena had offended the spirits by refusing to surrender a cursed child. They predicted disaster for his family, his crops, his livestock. Some stopped speaking to him entirely. Others openly mocked Obiageli for bearing a broken child, as if the blindness were a reflection of some flaw in the mother. Ikena and Obiageli endured the cruelty in silence. They had chosen their daughter, and they would not unchose her. For 3 years, Adannaya did not make a single sound. The silence broke on the night of the harvest moon. Obiageli had carried Adannaya to the edge of the village, where the women gathered to sing the songs that celebrated the season's yield. The harvest songs of Nkwo were famous throughout the region, complex melodies layered over rhythmic clapping, the voices of dozens of women rising and falling in patterns that had been refined over centuries. Adannaya sat in her mother's lap, her blank eyes open but seeing nothing, her small body still and quiet as it always was. Obiageli sang with the other women, her voice blending into the chorus, her hands clapping the ancient rhythms. And then, without warning, Adannaya opened her mouth and sang. The sound that emerged from the 3-year-old child stopped every woman in the gathering. It was not a child's sound. It was not a human sound, not entirely. It was something that seemed to come from deeper than a throat, deeper than a body, a tone so pure and so resonant that it vibrated in the bones of everyone who heard it. The note hung in the air long after Adannaya closed her mouth, echoing off the trees and the earth and the sky as if the world itself were trying to hold onto it. The women stared. Some clutched their chests. Others backed away in fear. Obiageli held her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face, unsure whether to feel joy that her child had finally made a sound or terror at the nature of that sound. Adannaya opened her mouth again. This time, she did not produce a single note. She sang a melody, complete and complex, unlike anything the women of Nkwo had ever heard. It moved through scales that did not exist in their musical tradition, touched frequencies that seemed to press against something inside the listeners, something locked and hidden that the music was trying to reach. One of the older women in the gathering, a grandmother named Mbik who had been suffering from a tremor in her hands for years, felt the shaking suddenly stop. She held her hands up in the firelight, steady for the first time in a decade. She stared at them, then at the blind child, and she understood before anyone else what Adannaya's voice could do. The child could not see, but she could heal. Word spread faster than Ikena could contain it. Within weeks, people were arriving from villages across the kingdom, bringing their sick and their suffering, begging for the blind child to sing for them. Ikena tried to turn them away. He was protective of his daughter, suspicious of the sudden interest from people who had mocked his family for keeping her alive. But the desperation of the sick is not easily refused, and Obiageli, who had a softer heart than her warrior husband, convinced him to allow Adannaya to help those who needed it most. The results were extraordinary. A man who had been deaf since birth sat before Adannaya while she sang, and tears poured down his face as sound entered his world for the first time. A woman whose legs had been paralyzed by a fall from a tree felt sensation return to her limbs, first as tingling, then as warmth, then as full movement. A child who had been born with a twisted spine straightened over the course of 3 songs, his bones rearranging themselves as if guided by invisible hands. But Adannaya's most remarkable healings were of the mind. A young warrior who had returned from battle unable to speak, his eyes vacant, his body present but his spirit clearly elsewhere, was brought before her. Adannaya sang to him for an hour, a melody so sorrowful that those who listened wept without knowing why. The warrior blinked, his eyes focused. He looked around the room as if waking from a nightmare, and when he spoke, his first words were the name of the friend he had watched die in battle, the memory that had shattered his mind. He was not cured instantly, but he had been reached. The song had found him in whatever dark place his consciousness had retreated to, and it had shown him the way back. Adannaya was 4 years old. She could not see the faces of the people she healed. She could not speak to them in words, for she had never learned to form language. But she could sing, and her songs did what words and herbs and prayers could not. The kingdom took notice, and when kingdoms take notice of unusual gifts, the consequences are rarely gentle. King Ozioma of Nkwo was a practical man who believed in using every resource available to strengthen his rule. When he heard reports of a blind child whose voice could heal wounds and restore broken minds, he did not dismiss them as superstition. He sent his advisors to investigate. They returned with confirmation that the stories were true, and with a recommendation that the child be brought to the palace where her gift could serve the crown. Ikena refused the king's summons. He had seen what happened to people with unusual abilities who entered the service of powerful men. They were used until they broke, then discarded. His daughter was not a tool. She was not a weapon. She was a child, blind and voiceless, and he would protect her from those who saw her only as a means to their own ends. The king did not ask a second time. He sent soldiers. Ikena fought them at the door of his home. He was a skilled warrior, and he wounded 3 of the king's men before they overwhelmed him. They beat him in front of his wife and daughter, breaking his arm and his ribs and his pride, and they took Adannaya while Obiageli screamed and clawed at their armor. Adannaya was 5 years old when she was taken from her parents. She would not hear her mother's voice again for 12 years. The palace of Nkwo was vast and cold. Adannaya was given a room in the eastern wing, near the quarters of the royal healers, and she was attended by servants who treated her with a mixture of reverence and fear. She was fed well, clothed in fine fabrics, given everything a child could want except the two things she needed most: her parents and her freedom. King Ozioma's eldest son, Prince Chukwuemeka, had been suffering from a madness that had descended on him 3 years earlier. He had been a brilliant young man, the pride of the kingdom, groomed to inherit the throne. Then, during a hunting expedition, something had happened. No one knew exactly what. The prince had entered a cave pursuing a wounded leopard and emerged hours later changed. His eyes were wild. His speech was fragmented and strange. He alternated between fits of violent rage and periods of absolute stillness in which he seemed to stare at things no one else could see. The kingdom's best healers had tried everything: herbs, rituals, sacrifices, prayers. Nothing reached the prince. His mind was locked behind a wall that no medicine could penetrate. The king had watched his son deteriorate for 3 years, and his desperation had grown into something dangerous. He would try anything, use anyone, sacrifice whatever was necessary to bring his son back. That is why he had taken Adannaya. The first time she was brought before the prince, the 6-year-old girl stood in the doorway of his chamber and tilted her head, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The prince sat in a corner, his hair matted, his eyes darting, his body rocking in a rhythm that seemed to follow music only he could perceive. Adannaya began to sing. The effect was immediate. The prince stopped rocking. His eyes, which had been scattered and unfocused for years, slowly turned toward the source of the sound. His body went still. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened and slowed. For the first time in 3 years, something like recognition appeared in his face. The king watched from behind a screen, his hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His son was responding. After 3 years of silence and madness, his son was responding to this blind child's song. He ordered Adannaya to sing to the prince every day. The healing of Prince Chukwuemeka took 7 years. This was not a simple recovery. The prince's mind had not merely broken. It had been invaded. Whatever he had encountered in that cave, whatever had looked back at him from the darkness, had left something behind in his consciousness, a presence that occupied the spaces where his sanity had lived. Adannaya could feel it when she sang to him. Her songs encountered resistance, a force that pushed back against the healing, that fought to maintain its hold on the prince's mind. She learned to fight it. Day by day, song by song, she reached deeper into the prince's shattered consciousness and drew him back toward himself. She sang away the terrors that woke him screaming in the night. She sang away the visions that made him claw at his own face. She sang away the voice that whispered to him from inside his own head, the voice of whatever had followed him out of that cave. But each victory cost her something. Adannaya discovered, in the 2nd year of the prince's treatment, that healing the mind was not like healing the body. When she sang away a broken bone or a fever, the injury simply dissolved, unmade by the frequencies of her voice. But when she sang away madness, it did not dissolve. It transferred. The darkness she drew out of the prince's mind entered her own, settling into the corners of her consciousness like sediment at the bottom of a river. At first, the effects were small. A nightmare here, a moment of confusion there, a flash of something in the darkness behind her blind eyes that she could not explain and could not forget. She told no one. The king expected results, and she had no one to confide in. She was alone in a palace full of people who saw her as a tool, and she bore the accumulating weight of the prince's madness in silence. By the 4th year, the transfer had become severe. Adannaya began hearing whispers that she knew were not real. She began experiencing moments where she lost track of where she was, drifting into states that felt like the madness she was extracting from the prince. She developed a tremor in her hands that came and went without warning. She found herself singing in her sleep, melodies she did not recognize, songs that seemed to come from whatever dark thing she was pulling out of Chukwuemeka's mind. She was 13 years old, blind, alone, and slowly going mad. But she did not stop. In the 7th year, when Adannaya was 12 and Chukwuemeka was 24, she sang the final song. She had spent months preparing for this moment, building toward it with careful, deliberate sessions that pushed deeper into the prince's mind than she had ever gone before. The presence that occupied him had retreated to its last stronghold, a dark place at the very center of his consciousness where it had wrapped itself around his earliest memories, anchoring itself to who he was at the most fundamental level. To reach it, Adannaya had to follow it there. She sat before the prince in his chamber, alone as she always was during their sessions, and she began to sing. The melody started gently, the familiar phrases that had become the foundation of their years together. Then it deepened. It descended into registers that the human voice should not have been able to reach, tones that vibrated not in the air but in the mind, frequencies that opened doorways between one consciousness and another. Adannaya felt herself falling into the prince's mind, moving through the landscape of his thoughts as if walking through a dark forest. She passed through the ruins of his childhood memories, the wreckage of his education, the shattered remains of the person he had been before the cave. She followed the trail of darkness deeper and deeper until she found it. The presence was vast and old and hungry. It had lived in that cave for centuries, perhaps millennia, feeding on whatever minds stumbled into its domain. It had attached itself to Chukwuemeka because he was strong, because a strong mind provided better sustenance than a weak one. It did not want to release him. It fought back against Adannaya's song with a fury that nearly overwhelmed her. But Adannaya had spent 7 years learning this enemy. She knew its patterns, its weaknesses, the frequencies that made it recoil. She sang with everything she had, every fragment of power her gift contained, and she tore the presence away from the prince's mind like roots being pulled from the earth. The presence, dislodged and desperate, latched onto the nearest available consciousness. It latched onto Adannaya. She felt it enter her like ice poured into her veins. It filled the spaces that the prince's transferred madness had already weakened, and it settled in with a terrible permanence that told her it would never willingly leave. But the prince was free. Chukwuemeka opened his eyes, truly opened them, for the first time in 10 years. He looked around his chamber with the bewildered clarity of a man waking from a decade-long nightmare. He saw the blind girl sitting before him, her body rigid, her white eyes streaming with tears, and although he did not understand what had happened, he understood that she had saved him. He reached out and took her hand, and Adannaya, for the first time in her life, spoke. A single word escaped her lips in a voice raw and unused, barely more than a whisper. She said his name. Then she collapsed. For 40 days, Adannaya lay in a chamber in the palace, her body burning with fever, her mind besieged by the presence that had taken up residence inside her. The royal healers attended her constantly but could do nothing. Her affliction was not of the body. It was of the mind, of the soul, of whatever part of a person the presence fed upon. The king was torn. His son was restored, lucid and whole for the first time in a decade. The kingdom was celebrating, but the instrument of that restoration was dying, consumed by the very darkness she had extracted from the prince. Chukwuemeka refused to leave Adannaya's side. He owed her everything, his sanity, his future, his life. He sat beside her mat and held her hand, speaking to her even though she could not respond, telling her about the world she had never seen, describing the colors of the sunset and the shape of the mountains and the way light played on water. He told her about his memories of the years when she had sung to him, how her voice had been the only thing that reached him in the darkness, how it had been his guide back to himself. He did not know if she could hear him, but he did not stop. On the 40th night, as Chukwuemeka sat beside her in the lamplight, Adannaya began to sing. It was different from any song she had ever produced. It was quiet, barely audible, a melody so fragile that it seemed like it might break apart at any moment. But it carried a power that filled the room like warmth from a fire, a power that pushed against the darkness inside her, that refused to surrender to the presence that was trying to consume her. She sang through the night. The melody shifted and evolved, growing stronger as the hours passed, building layers of sound that intertwined and reinforced each other. Chukwuemeka listened, unable to move, unable to breathe, held in place by a sound that seemed to contain the entire history of healing. Every moment of pain she had absorbed and every life she had restored compressed into a single unbroken stream of music. As dawn broke, the song reached its crescendo. The sound that emerged from Adannaya in that final moment was not heard only in the palace. It was heard across the entire kingdom. People woke in their beds and sat up, their hearts pounding, their eyes wet with tears they could not explain. In the village where she had been born, Obiageli and Ikenna heard their daughter's voice for the first time in 12 years and fell to their knees. The song shattered the presence. It did not merely drive it away or force it into retreat. It broke it apart at a fundamental level, dissolving the ancient thing into fragments so small that they could never reassemble. The darkness that had lived in the cave for millennia, that had consumed the prince's mind and then tried to consume hers, was unmade by a blind girl's song. Adannaya opened her eyes. They were no longer white. For the first time in her life, they held color. Dark brown, deep and warm, the eyes of her mother looking out from her own face. She blinked in the light of dawn and realized, with a shock that stopped her breath, that she could see. Chukwuemeka was the first thing she ever saw. His face, tired and lined with worry, tears running freely down his cheeks. The most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed because it was the first. She looked at him, this man she had known only through sound and touch for 7 years, and she smiled. The years that followed were kind to Adannaya. King Ozioma, humbled by what he had witnessed and shamed by the memory of how he had taken her from her parents, released her from his service. He sent riders to her village to bring Ikenna and Obiageli to the capital, and he provided the family with a home near the palace so that they would never be separated again. Ikenna wept when he saw his daughter. She was no longer the silent baby he had held against his chest. She was a young woman with seeing eyes and a voice that could reshape the world. He held her for a long time, this child he had chosen to keep when everyone told him to let go, and he understood that his decision all those years ago had not been stubbornness or defiance. It had been the most important thing he had ever done. Obiageli could not stop touching her daughter's face, stroking her hair, holding her hands. 12 years of absence weighed on her like stones, and she grieved for the childhood she had missed, for the milestones she had not witnessed, for the years of her daughter's suffering that she had been powerless to prevent. But Adannaya did not carry bitterness. She had been through darkness that would have destroyed most people, and she had emerged not hardened but softened, not angry but grateful. She had her sight, she had her voice, she had her parents. She had survived. She had more than survived. She had been transformed. Chukwuemeka came to her often in those early months. He brought her gifts from the market, showed her the gardens of the palace, walked with her through a world she was seeing for the first time. He watched her discover color and shape and distance, watched her face light up at sights he had always taken for granted, and he felt something growing in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. Adannaya felt it too. This man who had sat beside her for 40 days, who had spoken to her in the darkness, who had refused to leave even when everyone else had given up. She had known his voice before she knew his face, had loved the sound of him before she could see the shape of him. Now, seeing him for the first time, she found that the face matched the kindness she had always heard. They did not rush. They had both been through too much for haste. They walked together through the seasons, learning each other in the light after years of knowing each other only in darkness. They discovered shared laughter and comfortable silences, the easy rhythm of two people whose souls had already been introduced even if their eyes had not. In the second year after her healing, Chukwuemeka asked Ikenna for permission to marry his daughter. Ikenna studied the prince for a long time. This man who had once been mad, who had been healed by the daughter Ikenna, had refused to surrender. Then he gave his blessing. The wedding was the largest the kingdom had ever seen. Adannaya wore white cloth woven with golden thread, and when she walked toward Chukwuemeka in the ceremonial grove, every person present heard a faint melody in the air, as if the trees themselves were singing. Adannaya never lost her gift. Her voice retained its power to heal, though she no longer needed to absorb the suffering she treated. Like a river that has broken through a dam, her ability flowed freely now, unrestricted by the limitations that had once made her gift a burden. She could sing away fevers and mend bones and calm troubled minds without any cost to herself. She used her gift generously. She established a place of healing near the palace where anyone, regardless of wealth or status, could come to be treated. She trained other singers in the techniques she had developed, teaching them melodies that, while not as powerful as her own, carried enough of the healing frequency to ease common ailments. She could not give them her gift, but she could give them knowledge, and knowledge was its own kind of medicine. She bore Chukwuemeka 4 children, all of whom inherited their mother's musical ability. Though none possessed her supernatural gift, they grew up in a household filled with song, where music was not entertainment but a way of understanding the world, a language that spoke to parts of the human experience that words could not reach. When King Ozioma died, Chukwuemeka took the throne, and Adannaya became Queen of Nkwo. She ruled beside her husband with a compassion that transformed the kingdom. She abolished the practice of abandoning children born with disabilities, declaring that every child carried a gift, even if that gift was not immediately visible. She established schools where the blind were taught to navigate the world through sound, where the deaf were taught to communicate through touch, where those whom society had discarded were given the tools to contribute. The kingdom prospered under their rule, not because of military conquest or trading wealth, but because of something simpler and rarer: kindness. The understanding that a society's strength was measured not by how it treated its strongest members, but by how it treated its most vulnerable. Adannaya lived to be very old. Her eyes, which had been blind for 12 years and seeing for many decades after, eventually dimmed again as age took its toll. But she did not mourn the loss. She had seen enough. She had seen her husband's face on the morning of their wedding. She had seen her children take their first steps. She had seen the sun rise over the kingdom she had helped to build. And she could still sing. In her final years, she composed the melody that the mothers of Southern Cameroon still hum to their children today. She called it the Song of Mending, and she designed it to carry the essence of her gift in a form that anyone could use. It was not as powerful as her own voice, could not mend broken bones or cure madness, but it could soothe a crying child, ease a fever, calm a troubled mind, could do what the best medicine has always done, could remind the suffering that they were not alone. She taught the melody to her daughters, who taught it to theirs. Each generation carried it forward, the notes changing slightly with time but the core remaining, an unbroken chain of healing stretching from a blind girl's first song to the lullaby a mother hums tonight. Adannaya died on a morning in early spring, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Chukwuemeka's hand in hers as it had been for decades. Her last breath carried a note, soft and clear, that lingered in the room long after her chest went still. Those who were present said the note was not sorrowful. It was warm. It was complete. It sounded like a song that had finally found its ending. And so the next time you hear a mother singing to her child, the next time a melody stops you in the street and makes your chest ache with an emotion you cannot name, the next time music reaches a place inside you that nothing else can touch, remember this story. Remember that once, in a kingdom that the modern world has forgotten, a blind girl opened her mouth and changed everything. Remember that she was taken from her family and forced to serve the powerful, that she spent her childhood healing a stranger's madness at the cost of her own sanity, that she faced a darkness older than memory and broke it with nothing but her voice. Remember that she chose kindness over bitterness, love over anger, generosity over the resentment she had every right to feel. Remember that she proved, with her life and her gift and her song, that the most powerful force in the world is not strength or wealth or cunning. It is the willingness to heal what others have broken. It is the courage to sing in the dark. That is the story of Adannaya, the night singer. That is how music learned to heal.